This morning's scripture reading comes from the book of Genesis, verses 21 through 34. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife, since she was unable to have children. The Lord was moved by his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. But the boys pushed against each other inside of her, and she said, "If this is what it's like, why did it happen to me?" So she went to the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb. Two different peoples will emerge from your body. One people will be stronger than the other. The older will serve the younger." When she reached the end of her pregnancy, she discovered that she had twins. The first came out red all over, clothed with hair, and she named him Esau. Immediately afterward, his brother came out, gripping Esau's heel, and she named him Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. When the young men grew up, Esau became an outdoorsman who knew how to hunt, and Jacob became a quiet man who stayed at home. Isaac loved Esau because he enjoyed eating game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once when Jacob was boiling stew, Esau came in from the field hungry and said to Jacob, "I'm starving. Let me devour some of this red stuff." That's why his name is Edom. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright today." Esau said, "Since I'm going to die anyway, what good is my birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Give me your word today." And he did. He sold his birthright to Jacob. So Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew. He ate, drank, got up, and left, showing just how little he thought of his birthright. The word of the Lord.
And so the beat goes on. As we continue our journey through Genesis, reflecting on our faith ancestor stories, the beat of deceit and family dysfunction goes on. Today's story focuses on a family of four. Isaac, who you might recall is one of Abraham's sons, Rebekah, Isaac's wife, and one of the few Old Testament wives who did not share their husband with another wife, and Isaac and Rebekah's twin sons, Esau and Jacob. For this story to jump out of the pages and into our lives, it really is necessary to read this continuing narrative as it extends through chapter 33. I was tempted to just have Greg read these 8 chapters and call it a day. But I'm going to trust in your curiosity to go home and read how the story unfolds, for it is quite the story of these two brothers. But for today, let's give some focus to these 13 verses, where it's apparent from the outset that there's going to be trouble and dysfunction within this small family. It is not a leaver to beaver family, and I trust that at least some of us still remember what that means. Once again here in Genesis, we find a woman who is barren, Rebekah, but finally blessed with pregnancy like Sarah was. And not just with one son or heir for her husband Isaac, but with 2. She was thrilled to be pregnant, but perhaps for a bit. But notice the writer of Genesis quickly rains on her parade. The children struggled within her, and she said, "If it is to be this way, why do I live?" So she and God have a conversation. The first time in Genesis that God has a conversation with a woman. And God tells her that her 2 children will be divided. The youngest, albeit by only minutes born apart, would be the strongest. Well, right out of the gate, this was a surprise. Because in the ancient community, the eldest son was always the heir and the favorite. At any rate, Esau and Jacob were born. Heel-grabbing Jacob, growing up to be his mama's favorite, a quiet boy who lived in tents. While the elder Esau was a man's man, like his dad, and he was a hunter and stayed in the field. Already, instead of allowing the ancient listeners and now us as readers of this story to begin preparations for a celebration of twin births, we are drowning in despair, or we should be, as we see the early divisiveness between husband and wife and twin sons. You might remember with me a few weeks ago, right here at Bluegrass UCC, when we stood with Sarah and Shannon Cribbs and their beautiful twins, Spencer and Isabel. You might remember how we celebrated their loving family, we blessed them with waters, and then we sent them on their new journey to Virginia. There was not a dry eye in the house that Sunday morning, including my own. We were all so moved with tears of happiness and thanksgiving. In this Genesis story, not so much. It seems that the further we go into Genesis, the closer we get to home. And the beat goes on.
My story starts in Haiti, 1978. My mom was only 15 and pregnant, my dad 22. My dad left me and my mom and came to America for a better life. When I was about 7 months old, my mom decided to take my aunt to take me to America under a different name. When I came to America, I was passed around with no status or papers. My father later became a U.S. citizen and never applied for me. I am now 35 years old, and I don't know any other country but here. And I don't have enough money to fix my situation either. I feel lost, wrote Chanel from Boston.
If you live in the United States today, at some point you or your relatives were immigrants. Whether your ancestors came from Asia via Alaska some 30,000 years ago, or whether your family immigrated from another country just a year or two ago, perhaps you, like me, have some degree of Native American Indian in you, and you yourself were bombarded. The story of America is one of immigration, and the United States is not the only country whose history has been profoundly affected by the arrival of foreigners escaping war and famine and persecution, simply seeking a better life. And that beat goes on.
I came here when I was 3 years old. I'm currently 16. Everybody else in my family that is here with me is legal. Everybody but me. I'm close to finishing high school. Too close. I love America. This is my home. But this is no way to live. I didn't choose to be here. My family was fleeing from gangs and wanted to avoid harsh treatment of my mom by the men in those gangs. Not to mention the very real reality that I could be killed or sold into slavery. I just want to go to college, study medicine, and save lives. Is that too much to ask for? I just want to belong here. I want to be an American citizen, wrote Isabella from Lexington.
And the beat goes on. This past Thursday, July 31st, clergy and members of the United Church of Christ joined Methodists, Unitarian Universalists, Quakers, Catholics, Baptists, Jews, and other faiths, gathering at the United Methodist Building in Washington, D.C. for a day of prophetic action on immigration policies at the White House. Earlier this summer, at our annual conference in Indianapolis, Miss Hattie and I were privileged to hear Reverend Linda Jaramillo, a UCC national officer, preach. At our worship in June, Linda was appropriately dressed in robe and stole, calling the United Church of Christ block of the Indiana-Kentucky Conference to go into the world as oaks of righteousness. On Thursday of this past week, I watched on YouTube streamed live as Linda joined these other faith leaders in Washington, and she was arrested. With her white stole draped across her t-shirt, looking downward towards her walking shoes, her hands handcuffed behind her. I might imagine she was continuing to offer prayers of justice and reconciliation for the least among us, including the desperate cries of children and families. You know, church, I've lived longer than some of you and not as long as others. And I found that the hardest decisions in life are the gray areas. In our scripture passage this morning, we meet a family of flawed personalities, for as we read before and after our story today, Isaac, Rebekah, Esau, and Jacob were all very imperfect people, facing a lot of gray areas with unclear solutions. Now, Jacob was almost blind and getting old. A vulnerability and desperation that many of us share or understand. Rebekah, like the other women in the ancient community, was trying to make the most of her life. It was indeed a life dependent on those in power, men. While some would characterize her actions with her sons as conniving and spiteful, as she would eventually coach Jacob into tricking his aging dad into blessing him as the heir instead of the elder son Esau. It is so easy to rush to a quick judgment of this, but perhaps Rebekah made a decision to protect the most vulnerable son. For reading between the lines in our scripture and reading the Hebrew translation of that, Jacob was the youngest and the one not considered to be a man's man because he didn't take to the hunting field like his dad. So perhaps Rebekah, in a motherly way, knew that Jacob would be pushed to the margins of society because he was the second son and because he didn't fit the mold. Certainly, she was deceitful in her advocacy, as was a crying child asking for a swimming pool. But sometimes desperate times call for desperate measures. Not the swimming pool, but for a marginalized son. Similar, it seems to me, like standing up for justice even when you move from pulpit to jail with your stole on. As the story of Esau and Jacob continues, we notice all their warts, and they, like us, have a lot of them. Esau, on discovering that he'd been tricked by his brother, threatened to kill him. So Jacob fled the country for over 20 years. But as we'll see, eventually when Jacob returns and asks for forgiveness, Esau welcomes him with open arms. We observe in this story a family of unbalanced characters who make a lot of mistakes. And yet they continue in God's covenant and in covenant with one another. Before Jacob tricks Esau out of their father's blessing, in the story Greg read today, Esau sells his birthright to Jacob because Esau comes home from the field very hungry. Jacob had been in the kitchen and has a temptation that Esau just cannot resist. Good soup. So before Jacob tricks his brother, he plays on his weakness, doesn't he? Because of the imbalances between them, their family was fractured. And the beat goes on. Gray areas, difficult decisions, conflicting political views, diverse theological lenses. That beat goes on, does it not? I shared with the kids last night that beat goes on as much or more than they did in the ancient community for which these sacred texts were written. For right here, in this amazing church family of Bluegrass United Church of Christ, we are authentic and loving. We are committed to our church and to one another. And yet, we are so different. And yet, we too face the choices between which beat of the drum we will march to or believe in. When there is an imbalance of power and privilege, life and love for us all suffer. Let me say that again, church. When there is an imbalance of power and privilege, life and love suffer. My heart breaks this morning. As a privileged person of race and education, economics and citizenry, my heart breaks for those who don't share one or more of these privileges. My heart breaks this morning for those born in our own country who are without home or food. In this very community, in Georgetown Road, my heart breaks for those born in our own country who struggle to survive, who are lonely or addicted, who are estranged from family and friends. And church, I hear it every week with phone calls, with knocks on the door, with emails. My heart breaks this morning. And my heart breaks. Oh, how it breaks. For these undocumented kids who are attempting to escape horrific conditions in their home countries. My heart breaks for their families, those who accompany them and those who stay back. My heart breaks, I swear it does. For all oppressed people of the world and God's family who continue to pay unjust sums for their very existence. My heart breaks. And I believe so does God's. But breaking hearts, my brothers and sisters, are not enough. We want peace? Then we first must have justice. We cannot have peace with others when there's a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. I have power, you don't. I belong to the right race, you don't. I have education, you don't. I have a spouse legally recognized in our state, you don't. I have a valid birth certificate, you don't. I have the right kind of family structure and you don't. I live in the right part of the neighborhood or part of the country, you don't. We want peace. You know, when Brenda and I traveled to Seattle to see her sister, we don't travel often, every other year, and we save up our money to fly first class because she's tall and I have bad knees. And a 4-hour flight across the country is painful. So as air traffic goes this way and air travel goes these days, it's not easy and it's not fun. And it doesn't matter if you're sitting in the front or sitting in the back. People are rude. So we were separated for a 4-hour flight. And we asked two people, the one sitting beside me, one sitting beside her, would you mind to switch? The one woman replied, oh no, I can't. I go to the restroom often. Have you seen first class seats? Not a problem. The guy sitting next to Bryn did not even grunt. And in my pastoral duty as we deboarded the plane, as we were walking behind them, I said, you know what? We cry for peace in our country, and we can't change seats on a plane. It would be funny if it were not. We want peace, and we've got to work for it. And we've got to live for it. We're called to be prophetic witnesses as we live out the truth that we are all God's children, all of us. First class, coach, economy, backseat, black, white, gay, straight, legal, not legal. We are all God's children. I don't have all the answers. Most days I don't even know the questions. There are a lot of gray areas in our world. Difficult choices, and a lot of them. And I don't profess to have the answers. And the beat I follow today is a very different beat from the beat I listened to several years ago, thanks be to God. For it haunts me. It haunts me to think of previous boisterous stances I've taken on any number of social, political, or religious issues. For I confess I too was beating the drums of injustice and superiority. But life has a way of changing us, of humbling us, of making us perhaps not so quick to judgment on who's right and who's wrong. There was a time that I was a huge advocate against letting anyone into our country that didn't belong here. Now I think we should put up lemonade stands. Why? Because of Maria. Maria is a member of my family you've never met. She is illegal from Mexico. She has a key to our house. She cleans our house. She has 3 daughters. Maria came into the house one day crying. Some 8 years ago. She's been in our family for 10. So why are you crying? And she said, I'm afraid they're going to send me back home and my girls will be here. I listened to her stories. I listened to stories of what happened to young girls in her home country. And it broke my heart. The same way that folks who have looked at me and as openly gay ministers, an openly gay person, and at first had an aversion to that. I didn't belong. They heard my story. We have some in our church family, I would bet, that would say that they face the same thing with race. But folks heard the stories. When we hear the stories, our hearts can be changed. Maria said to me, Marsh, call me whatever you want to call me. But I was going across that border with my baby girls. And I said to Maria, who do I write the check to for the attorney? The beat goes on this morning, church. But for you, for me, for our church, which beat goes on?